What if the true cost of war wasn't measured in missiles or strategy, but in the silence of one simple question no one in power wants to answer? A question that cuts deeper than politics, louder than headlines, and heavier than any speech delivered from behind a podium. It's the kind of question that grieving mothers whisper through tears, that veterans carry in their bones, that ordinary people feel but can't always put into words. And yet, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. If this war is truly necessary, if it is truly justified, if it is truly worth the lives of young men and women being sent overseas, then why are the children of those in power never the ones sent first? Why is sacrifice always demanded from the many, but never demonstrated by the few who make the decisions? That question is not just political, it's deeply human. And right now, it's echoing across America louder than ever before. Because while families across the country are saying goodbye to their sons and daughters, watching them board planes into uncertainty, there exists another reality, a reality where the children of power remain untouched, safe, protected, distant from the consequences of decisions made in rooms they will never enter. This is where the story begins, not with anger but with contrast. A single father preparing his children for the future versus a system preparing other people's children for war. A nation told to believe in honor and duty, while quietly noticing who is actually being asked to pay the price. And once that contrast becomes clear, everything changes. Because this isn't just about one war, it's about a pattern, a system, a truth that has existed for generations but is now impossible to ignore. The idea that war, for some, is strategy, but for others, it is loss. That for some families, it is a talking point, while for others, it is a folded flag handed over in silence. And as this reality sinks in, people are beginning to ask harder questions, not out of disrespect, but out of a demand for fairness, for accountability, for honesty. Because if a war is truly just, then it should stand on principles that apply to everyone equally, not just those without power, not just those without influence, but everyone. And that is where the discomfort begins, because answering that question truthfully would require confronting something many would rather avoid. It would require acknowledging that the burden of war has never been shared equally, that the people who decide rarely fight, and the people who fight rarely decide. And in that gap, in that undeniable distance between power and sacrifice, lies the real story. A story not of politics, but of people. Not of ideology, but of reality. And as we begin to uncover what is actually happening, one thing becomes clear. This is not just a debate. This is not just a headline. This is a moment of reckoning. A moment where a nation looks at itself and asks, are we truly living by the values we claim to stand for? Or are those values only meant for those who have no choice but to follow them? To understand why that question is hitting so hard right now, you have to look beyond the speeches and into the reality on the ground, where war is not an idea, but an irreversible outcome. Because within days of military escalation, the consequences stopped being theoretical. They became names, faces, stories that would never get a proper ending. Young men and women, some barely out of their teens, found themselves in environments where every second carried risk, where every decision could mean life or death. And when the first casualties came, they didn't arrive as statistics. They arrived as heartbreak. Families receiving calls they had always feared. Doors knocked on by uniformed officers carrying news that changes lives forever. The kind of news that turns ordinary homes into places of mourning overnight. These were not abstract losses. These were people with futures, plans, dreams, relationships, cut short in an instant. A 20-year-old who had barely begun to experience life. Parents who had spent decades raising a child, only to lose them in a matter of moments. Friends left behind trying to process a reality that doesn't make sense. And while all of this unfolded, something else happened, something that made the situation even harder for many to accept. the response from leadership did not match the weight of the loss. Instead of deep reflection, there were statements framed in strategy. Instead of visible grief, there were explanations of necessity, language that to some sounded less like empathy and more like calculation. And that disconnect, that emotional gap between those experiencing the loss and those explaining it, only widened the divide. Because for the families affected, there is no strategic framing that can replace a life, no justification that can undo the absence left behind. War, at its core, is not about winning or losing in the way it is often described. It is about what is taken and what can never be returned. And yet, even as the losses mounted, the broader system continued to function as it always does. Decisions being made, narratives being shaped, public perception being managed. But underneath all of that, something deeper was shifting. People were no longer just listening, they were comparing the reality of those being sent into danger with the reality of those making the decisions, not out of bitterness, but out of awareness, because once you see the contrast, it becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, families bracing for loss. On the other, lives continuing uninterrupted. Education, business, routine, completely untouched by the consequences unfolding elsewhere. And it's in that contrast that the emotional weight of the situation truly lands. Because war does not affect everyone equally. It never has. Some experience it directly, others only observe it from a distance. And while that has always been true, what's different now is how visible that difference has become. In an age where information moves instantly, where every loss is shared, where every story reaches millions, the separation between sacrifice and safety is no longer hidden. It's right there, in plain sight. And as more people begin to connect those dots, the original question grows louder, not out of anger alone, but out of a desire to understand, to reconcile what they are being told with what they are seeing. Because if something carries such a high cost, if it demands so much from so many, then people want to believe that cost is being carried fairly, that the weight is shared, that the responsibility is not one-sided. And when that belief starts to break, it doesn't just create disagreement, it creates distrust, a sense that something fundamental is out of balance. And that is where we are now, not just witnessing events, but questioning them, not just hearing explanations, but evaluating them. Because at the end of the day, no policy, no strategy, no justification can fully answer the emotional reality of loss. And until that gap is addressed, not with words, but with truth, the question will remain, not quietly, but louder with every story, every name, every life that becomes part of a conflict most people are still trying to understand. And this is where the conversation shifts from loss to responsibility. Because once people begin to process the human cost, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who carries that cost and who doesn't? Not in theory, but in reality. Not in speeches, but in lived experience. Because while one group of families is preparing for the worst, there exists another group that will never have to face that same fear. And that contrast between those exposed to sacrifice and those insulated from it is what's driving the growing sense that something isn't right. This is not about targeting individuals. It's not about wishing harm on anyone. It's about examining a system where the burden of the most serious decision a country can make, war, is not shared equally. Because when leaders speak about duty, about honor, about patriotism, those words carry weight. They ask for belief, for trust, for unity. But those same words also invite a simple, powerful question. Do they apply to everyone or only to some? Because if sacrifice is truly a national value, then it cannot exist as a one-sided expectation. It cannot be something demanded from ordinary families while remaining optional for those at the top. And this is where the discomfort intensifies. Because the reality many are starting to see is not just unequal, it feels fundamentally disconnected. On one side, young people stepping into danger, fully aware of the risks. On the other, a world of safety, stability, and distance from those same risks. And again, this is not about blame, it's about consistency, about whether the principles being promoted are actually being lived. Because nothing exposes a gap in values faster than visible contradiction. When people see leaders calling for strength while protecting their own from its consequences, it doesn't just raise questions, it reshapes perception. It challenges the idea that the system operates on fairness. And once that belief begins to crack, it affects everything else. Trust becomes harder to maintain, messages become harder to accept, and the gap between leadership and the public grows wider. Because at its core, this isn't just political, it's moral. It's about whether decisions that carry life and death consequences are being made with a full understanding of their impact, not just intellectually, but personally, because there is a difference between authorizing risk and living with it, between speaking about sacrifice and facing it within your own family. And people can feel that difference. They may not always articulate it in policy terms, but they recognize it instinctively. It's the difference between shared responsibility and distant authority, between leadership that stands alongside the people and leadership that stands apart from them. And as this awareness spreads, it begins to unify perspectives across lines that are usually divided, because fairness is not a partisan idea. Accountability is not limited to one group. The belief that everyone should be held to the same standard, especially when lives are involved, is something that resonates broadly. And that's why this moment feels different. Because the conversation is no longer confined to politics. It has moved into something deeper, a reflection on values, on expectations, on what it truly means to lead. Because leadership at its highest level is not just about making decisions. It's about standing behind them in a way that demonstrates integrity. That shows the same standards apply at every level. And when that doesn't happen, when there is a visible gap between what is said and what is lived, people notice. They always have. The difference now is that they are speaking about it more openly, more directly, more persistently, because they are no longer willing to accept answers that avoid the core issue. They are no longer satisfied with explanations that address everything except the question itself. And that question remains as powerful as ever. If the cost is so high, if the stakes are so serious, then why is that cost not shared equally? Why does sacrifice seem to flow in one direction? And until that question is answered, not with rhetoric, but with reality, it will continue to define this conversation, not as a moment of division, but as a test of whether the principles that are spoken so confidently can withstand the scrutiny of lived experience. And this is where everything comes together, not in a moment of outrage, but in a moment of clarity. Because after all the arguments, all the statements, all the attempts to explain and justify, what remains is something far more powerful than any political narrative: the reality of loss and the undeniable weight of a question that still has no clear answer. This isn't about winning an argument anymore. It's about confronting a truth that sits quietly beneath everything else. A truth that families who have lost someone already understand in the deepest way possible. That when a life is gone, nothing else matters. Not the strategy, not the messaging, not the justification, just the absence. Just the silence left behind where a voice used to be. And that's what makes this moment different, because people are no longer just observing events, they're connecting them. They're seeing the full picture, the decisions, the consequences, and the imbalance between them. And once that connection is made, it changes how everything is viewed, because it forces a level of honesty that can't be avoided. It asks whether the system we accept is truly aligned with the values we claim to hold, whether fairness is something we believe in or just something we talk about. And it does so in the most direct way possible, by pointing to the gap between those who are asked to sacrifice and those who are not. That gap is no longer abstract. It has become visible, measurable, undeniable. It exists in the difference between a family receiving a folded flag and another continuing life as normal, between a future cut short and a future that remains untouched. And that contrast is not easy to sit with. It's not supposed to be, because it challenges something fundamental: the idea that we are all part of the same system, bound by the same expectations. When that idea is shaken, it creates discomfort, but it also creates awareness. And awareness is where change begins, not through force, not through anger, but through recognition, through the understanding that something needs to be examined more closely, more honestly, more completely. Because at the end of the day, this is not about any one individual. It's not about assigning blame to a single person or pointing fingers for the sake of it. It's about a principle, a standard, the belief that decisions of this magnitude should come with a level of accountability that matches their impact. That if something demands the highest level of sacrifice, it should also reflect the highest level of responsibility. And that responsibility should not be selective. It should not depend on status or influence or position. It should be universal. Because anything less creates a divide that cannot be ignored. And that is the divide people are feeling right now. Not just politically, but emotionally. A sense that the burden is not shared, that the risks are not equal, that the system as it stands asks more from some than it ever will from others. And that realization doesn't fade quickly. It lingers. It shapes how people think, how they trust, how they respond moving forward. Because once a question like this takes hold, it doesn't disappear. It evolves. It becomes part of a larger conversation about fairness, about leadership, about what kind of society people want to live in. And that's why this moment matters. Not because it provides all the answers, but because it refuses to ignore the question. A question that continues to echo, not just in headlines, but in homes, in conversations, in quiet moments of reflection. If something is truly worth the cost being asked, then who should be willing to pay it? And until that question is answered in a way that feels real, not just spoken, but demonstrated, it will remain. Not as noise, but as a signal. A reminder that the true measure of any decision is not just in what it achieves, but in who it asks to sacrifice for it.